Hello and welcome to Beyond GDP, the Social Progress Podcast, where we're talking to people from government, business and civil society who are trying to create better communities and a better planet. In today's programme, we're going to be focusing on the issue of how do we heal divisions in our society. Social Progress Index data is clear that declining rights and growing intolerance are having a negative effect on social progress globally and fueling a rise in authoritarian populists who are really implementing programs that seem to be setting the world backwards. So how do we actually build inclusive societies? How do we heal divisions? We know there's a lot of anger. We know there's a lot of division between people. How do we tackle that? How do we bring people together? Well, my guest today, Anwar Akhtar of the Samosa Media, knows all about that. He's an educator, he's an arts impresario, all focused, working in Britain on bringing together black and minority ethnic communities, BME communities, and other communities around shared cultural and educational heritage. Anwar is really someone who knows the story on the front line, is someone who's really worth listening to.
I started to speak, and I spoke to Radio 4, approached me on this, and we did a documentary. How can you diversify the curriculum in a way that works nationally and is inclusive? And so I did some research into this, and we ran into this thing about segregation in schools as well, which runs alongside diversity in the curriculum. And it's probably worth drilling into that for your listeners. So we ended up in a situation where schools are starting to look quite segregated in parts of Birmingham and Manchester and London. And it didn't seem to make sense because the neighbourhoods were very multicultural, the communities were very multicultural. So if you go around parts of, central Manchester and parts of, not, where I live in South London now, or parts of Tower Hamlets, why were the schools 90% BME, whilst the neighbourhoods are multicultural and they're kind of being lauded as urban multicultural neighbourhoods where integration's working, the bars are multicultural, the restaurants are. And there was that classic thing of, and it's just, there's a sort of heritage element to this. White young professionals, as they got to that point where they were going to have children, would move out to suburbia, whereas black communities stayed in the inner city. So it wasn't any kind of Machiavellian segregation kind of division. It was just, a sort of what was happening in communities. And thankfully now, as you're getting a larger black and Asian middle class, segregation in schools is actually dissipating more. But we had a moment where segregation in schools and all BME schooling was a real political hot potato. And I was looking at this and diversity in the curriculum. And we came up, I developed an argument speaking to people much wiser than me, that have been working around this in academia for a long, long time. I looked at all the issues and all the arguments about diversity in the curriculum. And then the sort of organisational structure, planning, delivery, producer, builder, in me said, what could work? What can we actually do? If I was to recommend to number 10, how you change the curriculum. And I sort of kept zooming in on two stories that I thought were really important and that should be taught in every school from Cornwall to Inverness, Land's End to John O'Groats. And that one is just the story of the British Indian Army, which is quite extraordinary about the impact of what it's had on modern Britain. Because I think the numbers were the British Army, as in, if you like the home regiments, the Yorkshire, the Lancashire, the Cornwall, the British Home Forces were 2.3 million. And then the British Indian Army in World War I was 2.1 million. And of course, you've got the Australian regiments, New Zealand, the Caribbean, where there was a lot of RAF technical support. And so, obviously, if Britain didn't really stand alone because the empire was always there, though the Churchill metaphor is very valid in the context of the Battle of Britain and, that conflict there. So, in a way, but Britain didn't really stand alone, because it always had the might of the empire behind it. And the debates about why 2.1 million British Indians served, many of them served just to earn a living, and many of them served because, they had part certain communities, a bit like how many Algerians served in the French army. Certain communities are just merged into, a career of serving the British military as a safe, stable, secure income. And that was particularly true in the Punjab and Northwest frontier regions. So, we're not going into the anthropology of that, and have some relatives that are part of that story. 2.3, sorry, I beg your pardon, 2.1 million, I think, British Indians served. Now, if you look at the media, and this isn't conspiratorial at all, this is just what's happened. The media narrative that we all grow up with, you watch Arnhem and the Battle of Britain, The Longest Day, all the great war movies that are on at Christmas, it's very much about the European theatre, isn't it? Or, the Guns of Navarone, or, and that theatre was predominantly, if you like, the European forces. So that although there was a big Indian presence in D-Day around logistics, the British Indian Army, they fought in sort of Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaysia and Burma and the Levant and North Africa and, the Italy campaign. But without that contribution, we all know that, was a large part of what broke the Axis forces. And that story is not in our school curriculum in any profound way. And I just thought that's just utterly bonkers, how that's, given the importance of World War II to the British Island story anyway, in the last century, to then exclude the contribution of Muslim, Sikh, Hindu forces. And of course, the fact that almost 40% of the British Indian Army is Muslim is a huge V sign to Tommy Robinson and all the thugs at the EDL and some of the nonsense that's coming from reform. But it's also quite a V sign to Islamic extremism that will point a message that we're not accepted and we don't belong here and we're not part of it. When Regent's Park Mosque was built as a tribute of respect to the Muslim forces in World War II. And I just remember thinking, just getting young people to study this from all communities is really important. And because I know time's short, the other one we looked at, which I just thought was bonkers in terms of its impact, was, and particularly because of the malignant legacy of Enoch Powell, which is being brought back again, and is now, people are trying to sanitize it as Powell was right. I mean, that bugger was Minister of Labour, wasn't he, in that government? And he went to the Caribbean and encouraged nurses in particular to come and work in the NHS. And the Migration Museum have done some wonderful stuff on this, and I looked at this in some detail. And there's a bonkers stat, and I know you like stats, Mike, so you're going to love this one. There's a bonkers stat that I think 3 out of every 7 midwives in Britain in the 1960s were Caribbean. Now, that's up there with, in terms of nation building, that's up there with Brunel, isn't it? In terms of overseeing the birth of the nation's children, it's up there with Robert Stevenson. And I just remember thinking that should be taught in schools because, that contribution as role models, because often young BME children are told to look at footballers and rappers and musicians as role models, and some of them are. But there's no greater role model than, the contribution that African Caribbean communities, particularly the nurses, made to the NHS. And that, I thought, every primary school, that's a story for every primary school. Right? And we got a little bit of pushback because, why didn't you do, why didn't you talk about the Bengal famine? Or why didn't you talk about slavery? And I thought, well, probably not going to work in a primary school, right? And I think the point is that, and conversations about empire and exploitation may follow, but it's about so I just think the curriculum is failing to represent modern Britain in terms of diversity and inclusion and contributions from Britain's Black and Asian communities. It's just failing. And that space is being exploited by extremists that, for whatever reason, we know what the far right racist extremists, take is on Britain, that, we're all just Johnny come lately recent arrivals and we're all kind of welfare scroungers. Well, my uncle set up a factory that employed thousands of people, and, so many, and, try and imagine Britain's transport infrastructure without the contribution of the African Caribbean community. And that was structural, the African Caribbeans were brought over to staff Transport for London and buses in Birmingham and Bristol and Manchester, and Asians were brought over to work in the textile sector, which is why so many of them went into textile and retail. And bemusingly, now many of them are on the Asian rich list, being lauded by the right-wing media, the same right-wing media that was hostile to them in the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, you've got the Ugandan Asian story. So I think putting this in the curriculum is really important about teaching our island story. And we're failing when we're not doing anywhere near enough.
Yeah, generalizing that a little bit. It's that point about education is not just about grade scores. Education is around a civic process of building a society where people are informed about the history, the culture, etc. And I think that I'm a great believer that history is a great immunization against extremism, because extremism can only thrive on very simple, unrealistic narratives. So there's a role that education's got to play in bringing us together and building us as a society. And also then on top of that, I think arts as well. Arts as a way that's a unifying force. And I think this is important because sometimes people see the challenging extremism thing as about directly just targeting the arguments of the extremists. We've talked in the past about the British counter-terrorism strategy and this whole program that's been called Prevent, that was all around challenging extremist narratives. Which I think the problem of it was it wasn't building a common dialogue. It was creating a set of narratives that were seen as being wrong, and people who held them as being wrong, and then was trying to challenge them, rather than saying, actually, let's look at this bigger picture and let's undermine the extremists by realizing that what they're saying is just rubbish. And I think that's we take this from the British context, we take it to other divided societies. I think the lessons are still the same. You won't challenge the extremists just by saying you're wrong. You've got to build that bigger civic and social infrastructure. That's the kind of core of it. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's three things that you triggered in that analysis you just made there, and that's the issues around prevent, cultural capital, and I think where the left are not doing great work either. And I'm very much on the left, I think, culturally, politically, my background. So I think on prevent's just been a disaster because it got weaponized as part of the culture wars. And the moment the Daily Telegraph is for it, the Daily Mail is for it, and the left have just got a responsibility to say, hang on, what's going on here? This doesn't sound right. And then, of course, when they brought Palestine into it, and Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian activism, that was it. It was all over. It's just a shouting match now. It's part of the culture wars. And so the best thing they could do with Prevent is we genuinely need a education policy that is inclusive and has buy-in from all sides to challenge extremism, violent extremism, be it religious, be it white, be it whatever. It has to be challenged. And there has to be a recognition that some of that threat comes from within Muslim communities. I say that as someone that has spent his whole life, defending the community I come from. But we have got issues with extremism within communities. So, Prevent has failed, and it just needs to start again because it's just become a manifesto for the Henry Jackson Society, as the left will immediately oppose it, shouting match. So I just avoid conversations about Prevent now because it's just a headache. It was the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu who started talking about cultural capital as quite an obscure kind of theory. And I think it was around the time of Gramsci and Hegemony, so it's that period. But actually, it's really important. And what it is that education is so much more than what you get in just a school classroom. So if you're lucky like I was, and I went to a great school, Burnage High School, brilliant sixth form, Loreto, you also get a really rounded arts education and cultural education. Education, the idea of cultural capital is and I'm kind of paraphrasing it here in my own analysis of it, but if you're exposed to barristers and lawyers and artists and scientists and travel as a young person, that has a profound impact on you. And a lot of working class people from diverse communities, particularly within the Asian community, I think it's similar in the African Caribbean community. Talent would go into law or finance or medicine or engineering. Because if your parents didn't speak English, which my parents didn't, spoke Urdu and Punjabi at home, you can work up the O levels and the A levels to do that and get there, which is why, and they're called the silent professions because they're not the professions around media and arts and journalism. But most working class Muslims of my generation wouldn't have had a clue how you would go and work at the Tate or Channel 4 News or the BBC or the World Service or the National Theatre or, go and be someone like Danny Boyle. Created a vacuum in culture. So there's a lack of cultural voices. So this idea of a lot of what we do is cultural capital. We go into schools, and I think I was talking about that in the story of the British Indian Army. That's a historical story. And but there's a cultural side to that as well, and diversity, and the stories of who we are now. And I think similar with the African Caribbean communities. So I think finding stories of commonality, stories that bring us together, and stories that aren't about division, is a really important part of nation building. And I think both the left, the right obviously are going to not hate it, but I think one of the problems in the left is we too often also end up playing on the right's kind of pitch around division. I've been quite bemused by this whole thing about global majority, and the whole global majority, because to me, I've always been very proud of being working class BME, and I grew up influenced by the struggles of black communities against police racism and the impact of Scarman, and I was part of the story of the Macpherson report because I was involved in politics and campaigning them. And their British Black Asian achievements, the Southall campaigns against racism, the story of Blair Peach, the anti-Nazi League, all that makes me quite proud to be British, actually. The Clash, is something that's very much it's a shared Black, Asian, white British story. And I think the thing about global majority is the moment you start saying that it's just about race, it's not about culture, it's about 60%, is it 6.3 billion out of 8 billion, are in the global south and their inequalities, but essentially saying that's everybody that isn't white. So you're defining everything as racial, which I think, and I get the social injustice, I get the economic injustice of how the global south has been treated, particularly economically in the exploitation of empire. And there's arguments about that. But I'm not sure you should put that on Britain's iron story about race. And, I think it's really dangerous if you start saying that, I'm part of a global majority that's got more in common with someone that is a working class kid in Venezuela than a white person I've grown up with in Manchester. That's not the case. So, so I think there is a danger of division around some of the language. And the other one, which we go back to education and integration, we had a bit of a ruck in Samosa Media about this. A couple of my colleagues were, have very strong and fairly, absolutely rightly. But I said we use the phrase diversify the curriculum rather than more robust language about decolonize the curriculum. And I'll be quite honest here of my own experiences now, and I think it's quite useful for you to hear actual experiences of people that are delivering work on the ground. If you say decolonize the curriculum to many head of a large sixth form or a large FE college or the VC at a university, there's really strong, valid arguments about decolonize the curriculum and where power lies, who tells the stories, who owns the space. And I'd be part of that work with Rich, Mix and Dara, right? So I've got a lot of sympathy with that argument. But to a VC or a head teacher, it's going to be arguments about Churchill, arguments about remembrance. You're going to upset the Royal British Legion, and I'm probably going to have the Daily Mail and GB News here in a couple of weeks looking for a story, and headache. So they're not going to engage, or it becomes part of the culture wars. Whereas actually, if you say diversify the curriculum, you're bringing something, you're adding, you're bringing the stories of the British Indian Army and the magnificent contribution of the Windrush generation and how that's changed our city so much for the better. And, how, it's just unimaginable Britain, modern Britain, without the contributions of BME communities, right? I mean, they're as essential a part of our island story, as the People's March for Jobs and the Geordie narrative and that great contribution from Northeast communities. It's not one's better than the other, or one's, it's just they're both really important, beautiful parts of our island story. And I think the danger with so I think I'm not going to say danger because I think there's valid arguments, but I mean another example I'll use is I've done so much work around policing and equality over the years. Anyone that says there hasn't been a transformational improvement in relations between Britain's Asian communities and the police is living in cloud cuckoo land, right? I remember the hatred of my generation towards the police because of Southall and an association that they were there to protect the skinheads, protect the BNP, and the attacks on Asian communities and the violence. I've got nieces and nephews that serve in the police now, and they just, there's been, I mean, there's still lots of issues and concerns about over policing of the black community. Though I think, again, the Macpherson report has been hugely impactful in actually improving things, right? And the police of today, just look at policing in France and look at policing in Britain and compare and contrast. So I think there's been huge positives that have been achieved as well that we should celebrate. And sometimes the left don't do that because we're so busy with the injustices of today.
Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. I think the positive there is the progress, and it's hard work. And I know that you get attacked from all sides for trying to build this stuff, but it's the telling those stories that about pull us together rather than divide us is so important. I think we'd hope we're going to be able to talk about a bit about Pakistan as well. You have to come back and we'll talk about
another
that
day,
another time.
another day.
But Anwar, thank you so much. It'll still be there.
Yeah.
Really enriching, fantastic to have you on, and thank you very much.
My pleasure, Michael. All the best. Take care. Thank you.